Yeah, we can start, Dr. Khadka.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Sama. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 24 of our IIDS webinar series on politics, economy, and public policy. Today, we have Dr. Keshab Giri. I'd also like to remind you all that I think we'll be missing a few of our colleagues from the US because of the time difference. Dr. Keshab Giri is joining us from Australia, and we had to start this 2 hours in advance. So Dr. Giri, there might not be our colleagues joining us from the US. Nevertheless, Dr. Keshab Giri is presenting a very interesting paper, his work, which is titled Rebel Governance of Marriage and Sexuality and Intersectional Approach. Dr. Keshab Giri is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sydney. So he's joining us from Australia, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Giri's research have been published in many top journals, such as the International Studies Quarterly, International Studies Review, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and Global Studies Quarterly. His PhD thesis is titled Experiences of Female Ex-Combatants in the Maoist Insurgency in Nepal, Endless Battles and Resistance. And his thesis also received the prestigious 2022 Thelma Hunter Gender and Politics PhD Prize by Australian Political Science Studies Association, APSA. Dr. Giri's research interests include primarily women combatants, intersectionality, gender and war, violent extremism, leftist insurgencies, critical security studies, rebel governance, governance of intimacy in rebel group, geopolitics of South Asia, and digital sovereignty. Dr. Giri is, in fact, coming out with a very interesting book, which is titled Intersectionality and Experiences of Female Combatants, and it's coming out in 2023. So we're very excited to have you, Dr. Keshab Giri, and thank you very much for your time, sir. Today's discussant is our own Dr. Sucheta Pyakuryal, who's the director of the Center for Governance and Academic Affairs at the Institute of Integrated Development Studies, IIDS, in Kathmandu, Nepal. Dr. Pyakuryal, ladies and gentlemen, has worked on a variety of projects assessing the newly formed federal state of Nepal and its fiscal arrangements, good governance, and gender studies in Nepal. Dr. Pyakuryal also has more than 20 years of experience as an academic and a researcher in political science, public affairs, and governance. Her most recent projects, which she is doing with her team at IIDS, have primarily focused on on the themes of federalism, education, women and migration, public sector accountability, women and development, poverty alleviation, and sustainable peace. In addition, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pyakuryal is also visiting faculty for the Central Department of Gender Studies at Tribhuvan University, where she teaches courses on gender and politics, gender and federalism, and gender in the policy-making process, also at the Kathmandu University School of Management's Master in Public Policy and Governance. And she teaches both master's and PhD programs. So we're very excited to have Dr. Keshab Giri, and we're also equally, thankful and very fortunate to have Dr. Sucheta Pyakuryal, who's an expert in gender studies, discussing the paper. So over to you, Dr. Keshab Giri. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Prabin, for a kind introduction. Absolutely delighted and feel privileged to be part of this IIDS webinar series. Thank you for kindly inviting me to share my research. Happy New Year to 2023, and what a way to start a new year. And also I want to extend my thank you to Dr. Pyakuryal for agreeing to be discussant on my paper. I'm grateful that you took time to read my paper and comment on it. Let me share my slides. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Just want to start with a caveat that my presentation today won't be a conventional presentation. This is so, in a sense, that I won't talk about my theoretical framework and methodology. I guess it would be boring if I talk about them, but I'm happy to elaborate on them in Q&A if anyone is interested here. And another thing to note that my paper actually engages on the things that I mentioned today in a more nuanced way. And this presentation is actually, I didn't say that before. This presentation is based on my soon-to-be published research article at International Studies Quarterly. I will start with a few conceptual grounding and then some of the key assumptions on what is rebel group, what is rebel governance. Then I will proceed on to discuss how marriage and sexuality have been discussed in the context of civil war and rebel governance. I will follow this up by 3 research questions. While I want to discuss the research design and theoretical framework, I will explain my case selection nevertheless. Governing marriage and sexuality is challenging, and nevertheless, many rebel groups are intent on doing it. I will try to unpack the puzzle. Why do rebel groups seek to govern marriage and sexuality? I will give an overview of extant literature on rebel governance, critical feminist IR or feminist international relation more broadly, and also sociological and anthropological works related to marriage and sexuality, which lay the groundwork for this paper. Then I will discuss what I found in my research, followed by contributions, policy implications, and further avenues for research. For the sake of simplicity and time, the characterization of rebel governance that I have come up with here is simple, but I guess this is enough to get us going into the main topic of today's presentation. I am international relations scholar. International relation as a discipline is state-centric, meaning that it doesn't have the theoretical lens to study and understand the territories not governed by the state. The areas beyond the reach of government are often portrayed as black spots, unknowable areas, or ungoverned territories. That means territories lacking any political authority and order. Or they fell into cracks of territorial trap. What this essentially means that we have entire globe divided into sovereign territories known as states. Even though we have many parts of different countries beyond the control of states, they still are presented within the borders of a state over which they have little control. Coming to non-state actors in international relations, the NSAs are often named as bandits, as mafias, warlords, as remnants of feudalism, or terrorist as nihilist who wants to destroy the existing structure, institutions, and order. By extension of cumulative mainstream IR wisdom gathered here, and linking back to our topic today, rebel-held territories are sites of anarchy and lawlessness, permitting debauchery, licentious behavior, and their hotbed of immorality. I will clarify a little bit on what type of insurgents that I'm focusing on. There are different types of insurgents. Some are roving insurgents. They don't have fixed and static territories of control. They are on constant move. For example, Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. Then there are insurgents who do occupy territory, but in doing so, they displace inhabitants who are deemed to be the others living in the territory they control. For example, Rwandan Patriot Front is a paradigmatic case of this. RPF removed English-speaking population from the areas it controlled in southern Uganda. Finally, there are insurgents who develop and establish systematic pattern of interaction with population under their control. They develop taxation system, public good provision, provision of security and protection, and some go further to regulate intimate spheres like marriage and sexuality in a more direct fashion. These latter types of incidents are topic of my inquiry. These include Maoist incidents in Nepal, Kurdistan Workers' Party PKK, FARC in Colombia, LTT in Sri Lanka, and so on. So then what is rebel governance? Ena Arjona, Nelson Kasfir, Jakaria Mampili aptly pointed out that when rebels secure territory, they must decide how they will interact with local residents. A larger group of rebel groups engage in some sort of governance, ranging from creating minimal regulation and informal taxation to forming popular assemblies, elaborate bureaucracies, schools, courts, and health clinics. But the involvement of insurgents groups in governance activities varies widely. However, in general, 3 scope conditions are necessary in rebel governance. They are territorial control, a resident population, and violence or threat of violence. According to Ana Arjona, rebel governance refers to a creation of social order by rebels that establishes a social contract between rebels and population under their control through a set of rules that structure human interaction in a given community during wartime, allowing for predictability to exist. So there are different ways the governance of marriage and sexuality have taken place across different insurgent groups, taking core assumptions from state centrism in international relations scholarship. We would expect rebel governed space to be a place where forced marriage and various forms of sexual violence are rampant, no matter who the perpetrators are. Often the perpetrators are states themselves. There are actually rebel groups that consistently engage in these crimes. ISIL in northern Iraq and Syria, various rebel groups in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, such as Congolese Army, FARDC, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, FDLR, Mai groups, and other various groups. Similarly, both Hutu and Tutsis in Rwandan civil war, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Cameroon in Cambodia are some other examples of groups who have engaged in forced marriage and sexual violence of different sorts. The literature on forced marriage and sexual violence largely tends to focus either on organizational and interpersonal dimension of forced marriage and sexual violence within victim, perpetrator, and weapon of war frameworks, or their governance within rebel group are analyzed within instrumental framework, minimizing in-group conflict, promoting interdependence, and enhancing cohesion and loyalty. Nevertheless, some research have gone further to study the link between forced marriage and political projects and their objectives, and also violent state building. However, the forced marriage and sexual violence within rebel groups are not universal. Many rebel groups do not use either forced marriage or permit sexual violence within or outside the group, while other groups like Lord's Resistance Army allow forced marriage, but they strictly prohibited some forms of rape and sexual violence. The Maoist incidents in Nepal neither forced its cadres and combatants into marriage explicitly, nor permitted any sexual abuse or violence in policy or practice, inside and outside the group. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil LTTE, FMLN in El Salvador are other examples of rebel groups that strictly prohibited sexual violence and rape in terms of policy and practice. Just want to clarify here that I don't mean to say that there were no single incidences of forced marriage or sexual violence. Neither do I in any way imply that imply the total absence of coercion and violence, including the structural and discursive violence and subtle indirect forms of coercion and violence. Rather, I'm focusing on their rarity in material terms. Moreover, I build on the perception of non-violence and non-coercion of interviews based on interviews and interlocutors who stressed freedom of love, marriage, and no restriction of sexual relationship between married combatants. I'm defining non-coercion and non-violence in a very narrow way here. While forced marriage and sexual violence have been widely documented, studied, and widely publicized, not much has been written on or discussed on subtle, non-coercive, non-violent governance of marriage and sexuality. And this is true for both academia and policy world. In this context, a few important questions arise. What does a non-coercive and non-violent rebel governance of marriage and sexuality mean for rebel groups' political agenda, social control, and politics of power within the group? What are the gendered impact of such non-coercive governance of marriage and sexuality? Importantly, how does this governance impact women combatants at the intersection of multiple systems of operation? I examine the governance of marriage and sexuality in the Maoist instance in Nepal to construct a theoretical explanation using abductive analysis that accounts for the puzzle of non-coercive, non-violent governance. I argue that rebel group still effectively governs marriage and sexuality non-coercively, non-violently to form, consolidate, and legitimize its political agendas and instrumentalize them for social control and political power accumulation. However, such governance reproduce gendered forms of insecurity and marginalization in public and private spheres, particularly for those female ex-combatants at the intersection of multiple oppressions such as gender, caste, class, ethnicity, and educational status. The case of the Maoist incidents in Nepal is significant in three major ways. First, rebels were broadly considered to be successful in achieving their political objective to establish a republican governing system. Secondly, one of the defining features of the insurgency was a relatively high number of women who participated as combatant as well as non-combatant in non-combatant roles. Maoists claim that the proportion of women combatants was as high as 40 to 50% of the total force. However, the UNMIN, United Nations mission in Nepal, said that numbers are about 20%. Apart from being combatants, women were prominently active in Maoist sister organizations such as All Nepalese Women's Association, Revolutionary. They also participated in various parallel government structure and ad hoc institutions set up by Maoists, such as local government, the judiciary, and cultural front. Finally, the Maoist insurgency in Nepal can reveal significant theoretical insights to explore gender impact of non-coercive, non-violent rebel governance of marriage and sexuality in the aftermath of conflict. The Maoists sought to govern marriage and sexuality in the rebel group as well as in the territory they controlled. Unlike similar rebel groups around the world, the Maoists permitted marriage, they didn't proscribe sexual relationship, and they allowed family. The PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, compelled its combatants to sign an abstinence contract requiring the combatants to abstain from love and sexual relationship. The Maoists in India saw sexual relationship between combatants as a problem for the movement, leading them to pursue anti-natalist policies. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka allowed marriage only after LTTE leader Prabin got married in 1984. The EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Front, also banned marriage earlier in the conflict, only to be allowed at the later stage of conflict. In case of FARC in Colombia, contraception was compulsory, and many women combatants were forced to abort in case of pregnancy. But extensive rebel governance, including governing marriage and sexuality, has many risks and challenges. Private sphere is difficult for a state to govern, let alone insurgents who have far less resources and organizational capacity. It is a murky area to set up rules and implement them. The Maoist leaders and many rank and file combatants alike sought to frame the insurgency, Maoist insurgency, in scientific, progressive, and modernist narratives and discourses that are enmeshed with parallel rhetoric on governance of marriage and sexuality, to which the Maoists use the same characterization: scientific, progressive, and modernist. The attempt is here not to discuss the semantics and accuracy of these terms. Rather, I look at how Maoists borrowed and used these terms to frame gender relations and to govern marriage and sexuality, to formulate further and fortify their political project. The Maoists sought to substantiate these claims by glossing their governance of marriage and sexuality in these terms. During the insurgency, science, modernity, and progress were often used interchangeably. For the Maoist leaders, science, progress, and modernity meant demolishing centuries-old feudal structures and religious cultural norms and values, along with economic structures, including old societal norms, values, cultural codes, practices of marriage to liberate women. And these include various practices like, child marriage, banning child marriage, allowing widow marriage, intercaste marriage, and so on. It is interesting that such linear conception of time and temporalities concerning marriage and sexuality directly relate to power and violence. Certain conceptions of time enforces and endorse efforts of domination, subordinations, and elimination that characterize heteropatriarchal politics, particularly post-colonial, decolonial, and critical development scholars argue that temporality couched in terms of modernity, progress, and science are colonial and neo-colonial constructs of the West and constitute varying forms of violence against people in global South and Third World. The terms like modernity, science, and progress are often invoked to ostracize traditional values and practices regarding marriage and sexuality in the Maoist stronghold areas, like in Tawang, in Nepal, and elsewhere. However, irrespective of the immense discursive power and symbolic violence involved, rebel governance initiatives, particularly the attempt to transform the gender relations to liberate women, are often met with hostility and create challenges for rebel groups, often requiring them to come up with intensive mode of governance. Rebel governance of intimacy incurs potential political costs as it seeks to disrupt existing gender relations. Moreover, it involves expending of scarce resources, more organizational capacity, and it potentially puts at stake the reputation of rebel group, even when it is non-coercive or non-violent. Despite numerous costs, it may not bear tangible benefits in the short term and may even fail to recoup the expended cost over the long term. Moreover, rebels who govern extensively are victorious at the same rate as rebel groups who do not. Therefore, the puzzle remains: why would any rebel group invest intensively in non-coercive and non-violent governance of marriage and sexuality, ignoring the political and ideational motivation for the governance of marriage and sexuality and their impacts, or analyzing through a narrow instrumental, tactical, and military strategy, only bears a limited understanding of how rebel groups formulate and consolidate their political projects and priorities. Further, it obscures how rebel groups entangle the private and public for the greater mobilization towards their military and political objectives. Possible reasons for rebel governance of marriage and sexuality may include symbolic reasons and practical consideration, and also revolutionary objectives of rebel groups. Apart from material and coercive components of rebel governance, such as public goods, service provision, and regulative functions, non-material and symbolic tools, rituals, and practices are vital for the legitimacy of rebel governance. Isabel Kaiser indicates, she looks at Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, that one of the many possible reasons for the abstinence contract in PKK, where combatants were not allowed to, they are not allowed to engage in libidinal activities or sexual relationships, was to reassure the parents and relatives of female combatants that their honor and chastity will not be breached. Another explanation tells that rebel groups with transformative objectives tend to create fundamentally new political institution and seek to restructure the society fundamentally along racial, gender, religious, class, or ethnic lines. While these explanations are useful in deciphering the puzzle, repurposing the B. Spike Peterson's argument here from Genealogy of Sex and Gender offers vital insight. Making rebel group also makes sex and gender. That is, the construction of narrative that a rebel group as an unrivaled legitimate force seeking to supplant a state often relies on shaping and reshaping private spheres. Marriage and sexualities are not mere side effect of governance, but a key location where subjectivities are formed and controlled, which are vital to the political objectives of the rebel group. Moreover, intimate sexual and family life are intricately enmeshed in political projects such as nationhood, ethnicity, and religion that require their collective reproduction in biological, legal, and cultural terms, work through sex, gender, and marriage. So how much time have I got left? I think I took a lot of time there.
Yeah, I think we've finished 30 minutes, Dr. Giri. So we've got another maybe. Yeah, it would be ideal 10 to 15 minutes because Dr. Pyakuryal is going to be commenting on your papers. Okay,
in that case, I will skip the existing works just in the interest of time. Okay, I will quickly move on to the findings. So I, based on the interviews and also extensive research, archival research of the Maoist documents, statements, and speeches, many primary documents from the Maoist insurgency, and also other secondary sources, I came up with 3 findings on why Maoist they were intent on governing private sphere in terms of marriage and sexuality. So 3 themes emerged: social control, political power, and differentiated impact. Although the Maoist characterization of governance of marriage and sexuality within the rebel group were laden with terms like science, progress, and modernity that defy the traditional norms and practices, the core mechanism of social control and accumulation of power through institution of marriage and governance of sexuality continued as before. The Maoists utilized the libidinal politics, an act of group of politicizing and militarizing affectual and sexual ties to amass power as a vital part of emotional and psychological control over combatants. In other words, the Maoists became greedy institution. That means institution that seeks to have a total control of its members. So they sought to govern not only sexual practices of the combatants, but also their emotional and psychological beings by monopolizing the commitments of its members. Through the governance of marriage and sexuality within the group, the Maoists replaced the traditional institution of marriage with elaborate codes and rules, instrumentalized marriage and sexuality to gain, retain, and contain combatants, and utilized the politics of martyrdom and constructed moral orders to control bodies, attain and maximize political power. I will briefly elaborate what I mean. So in Marxist thinking, when you go back all the way to Che Guevara, even Lenin and Alexander Kollontai, there is conflicting views regarding love. Often Marxist thinkers think that there are different definitions of love, but love in narrow sense means that is obstructive to the revolutionary goal. That means it will just weaken the commitments of cadres and combatants, and they will be distracted from their revolutionary zeal and goal. Che Guevara actually said that when he thinks of love, it means social love, the love towards revolution, not towards family or children or wife. But Maoists, they utilize, and Jeff Godwin calls this libidinal withdrawal. That means if the members in any group are engaged in a family or heterosexual or other forms of relationship, then that will weaken their commitment to the group. But it is surprising that Maoists allowed that to happen, despite despite Marxist literature and other literature showing that it would have different effect. So what they did was they replaced the institution of family and relationship and created a family in itself. That means they supplanted existing institution of family, existing norms and values, to create a greedy institution. So that not just attracted combatants and cadres, but also it motivated them to stay in the group. And also the loyalty with the couple, the conjugal relationship was modified in a sense that the loyalty with the group and attachment to the revolutionary objectives was the main primary objective, and personal relationship were relegated to the secondary concern. And by pulverizing those traditional institutions of marriage and its associated norms, values, and practices, they were able to accumulate the collective commitments and then use that towards political purpose. For example, during the martyrdom, they used martyrdom as challenging the frustration of the traumatic events towards hatred against the enemy, and then use that as a force against enemy. But despite in trying to destroy the existing hegemonic gender norms, they were actually reconstructing them in different forms. For example, the heteropatriarchal gender order was still very much there. I have interviewed many combatants. For example, they talk about like once they were in a group, and then when they had marriage, and then they became pregnant, then the burden of social reproduction was that fell squarely upon them. Although they had creches and commune system where the policy was to take care of the children collectively, that was not adequate. That was and then there was frustration against Maoist leaders when I spoke to some of the combatants that how come they have children, and then they can climb up the ladder and then and again to the position of power, while after having children, despite all those revolutionary rhetoric, they were still not able to continue on the path to gaining political power and getting to the position of power. But this, although it allowed Maoists to have social control and political power, it had differentiated impact on rebel groups, on women combatants. So I gave you example of how social reproduction was a burden for various women combatants, to the point that some of the Maoist leader that I spoke to, they had to postpone pregnancy until the end of the war because they thought that was disciplinary action. They won't be able to go much forward into their career if they become pregnant. And also this governance of marriage and sexuality meant that there were many inter-ethnic, intercaste, interclass marriages, and those at the intersection of gender, race, and class, they were the women combatants into that intersection were mostly affected. I have a few, it is well known that so many of women from lower caste background who married to upper caste combatants, male combatants, they had to, they had their marriage in tatters after the Maoist insurgency, and they were ostracized in their community. That didn't happen to women from higher caste. Often when female combatants married from higher caste marries lower caste male combatants, actually they were happily accepted in males in male combatants' family. So this kind of governance always has more impact, more negative impact to the women combatants at the margin, at the intersection of multiple oppressions and structures of power. I have a few quotes that I wanted to show, but that's all about the findings. I'm happy to discuss in detail later, but let me get to the contribution of this paper. The main contribution of this paper lies in building a theoretical explanation for the puzzle of non-coercive and non-violent governance of marriage and sexuality, using intersectional framework and abductive analysis. It does so by underlining the generative synergy between rebel governance literature and feminist international relations scholarship, highlighting the gendered and intersectional nature of rebel governance of marriage and sexuality, with critical inquiry into core sociocultural infrastructure of heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity. female ex-combatants' experiences of war and post-war peace in the private sphere in Nepal resonate with feminist international relations scholarships a claim on the private sphere as the political sphere of power contestation, revealing the continuity of multiple chains of violence from direct and visible to systematic and structural violence, and from war to post-war. The feminist intersectional lens shows that female ex-combatants from lower class, lower caste, and ethnic minorities are disproportionately impacted by the burden of social reproduction, ostracization, alienation, and many problems with the reintegration after the war. The findings also reaffirm the refrain call from feminist IR scholar that the dichotomy and hierarchy between public-private, social political order, moral political order, and emotional rational constitution are artificial and political. And the findings from this paper have significant implications for security policy and understanding of armed conflict. Security policies mainly focus on political motivations and ideological orientation, military structures, economic sources of rebel groups. As this research showed, marriage and sexuality can be a powerful, non-coercive, non-violent tools of governance for rebel groups, apart from in-depth understanding of political, ideological projects of insurgents. Regulation of marriage and sexuality can enlighten various other conflict dynamics, such as recruitment, retainment of combatants and cadres, and sexual violence in armed conflict. As such, the mutual exclusion of private and public spheres doesn't yield us a holistic understanding of politics and micropolitics of war and peace. In terms of future research, we could focus on the scope conditions for the development of rebel governance systems and institutions on marriage and sexuality, why some rebel groups pursue governance of marriage and sexuality in the way they do, and why others do not. Similarly, a comparative study can reveal interesting variations and broader patterns of rebel governance of marriage and sexuality. So actually, I'm in my current project, I look at this governance of intimacy in other rebel groups, such as in NSCN, National Socialist Council of Nagaland, Maoist incidents in India, and also other rebel groups in Myanmar. So I think I should start up now. That's all from me. Thank you.
Dr. Giri, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Sucheta now. Ma'am, could you just briefly provide your comments? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much again, Professor Prabin. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And the paper was extremely interesting. And it was after a long time that I actually kind of delved into a paper that talked about IR, international relations, and international politics. So it was refreshing, and it was a change for me, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. It was, I found it extremely important because it talks about a subfield that is actually becoming extremely important in political science. It talks about the intersection of multiple oppression, especially of caste, class, ethnicity, and gender. I was really interested in one paragraph where a rebel, fighter, a female fighter, says as to how, she, her husband had to go abroad, but then the leading cadre of the party, they sent their kids to India and elsewhere to study, and they were doing fine economically. So there was this class faction, there was that class issue within that gamut also. So that was very interesting for me. And then more than that, more than the intersection, it is one thing that really kind of caught my attention was how it is really captured Enlow's, or Cynthia Enlow's, this whole notion of feminist curiosity in IR as to how and why we need to kind of ask questions about where the women are and how they're being dealt with in regards to war tactics and coercion and so on and so forth. So that was those are the two themes that kind of stood out for me. Another thing that that has always kind of fascinated me was the leftist Marxist ideology, and Engels kind of he has expanded as to how this whole capitalism and patriarchy kind of control women, and that's the reason why they're more in sync and more compatible with one another. So I guess to a certain extent, his thesis, to a certain extent, again, as I said, explains as to why they do what they do, but it was very interesting how suddenly Morgan or Henry Lewis or Lewis Henry Morgan's thesis that he wrote in late 19th century, 1877, if I'm not mistaken, how that kind of came to the fore in this particular paper. So that was very interesting as a student of the subject. And one thing that I think is a little kind of, I wouldn't say a miss, but one thing that probably needs a little more attention is the interplay of patriarchy and all this, as to how patriarchy kind of impacts almost all existing social relations, and how that goes on to kind of impact marriage, family, other workplace relationship, and any and every situation of dominance and power. So that was something that I saw a little less of, if I may say so. And another thing that was really interesting was how you kind of brought in this notion of what we call the double bind in feminist criticism or feminist literature, as to how women kind of women, the Maoist women, how they were feeling this pressure of discriminatory rules within the party, as well as socio-cultural rejection, when they marry out of their caste, or when they marry supposedly high caste males. So that was very interesting to me, as to how they went in thinking that they'd be treated fairly, more fairly in this particular bubble, but then they ended up being a victim of this double bind. So that was something that we keep talking of, but then we don't see this in mainstream IR theses. So that was interesting. Another thing that was really, really interesting to me, is someone who again dabbles with politics or political theses, as well as feminist theories, is this notion of public and private, and how you've kind of shown as to how they kind of seep into the private sphere also, thus proving that political is personal, and so on and so forth. So that was also something that was very, very interesting to me, as to how you kind of showed in that there's nothing that was private, so to speak. So there was no private sphere for Maoist women cadre. So that was very interesting for me. Another thing that you may want to kind of see, because again, as I said earlier, I mean, Dr. Khadka also said that I do a little bit of bureaucracy and public sector as well. And so if you could look at this whole notion of modernity and organizing, or organization, so to speak, or even bureaucracy, I mean, Max Weber's talked about bureaucracy. So if you look at how, this concept of modernity is formed, is, of course, it is all about rationality. It's all about structure. It's all about, rules and regulations, or rules. It's all about, the bureau, so to speak. And it's very, very masculine, and it's very masculine in approach. It's very masculine in process. So the processes is also very masculine. The whole, playing out of the organization, or the whole rolling out of the organization was very masculine from the get-go. So there's a book that I read as a student by Cam Stivers. It was called Bureau Men, Settlement Women. So bureau is essentially very, very masculine. So when you're talking about a Maoist bureau, or a Maoist organization, or Maoist party, you'd probably want to kind of see as to how masculinity of bureaucracy or masculinity of organization kind of seeps into that particular organization as well. So I don't know if this is helpful for you, in your further research, but I just thought that was interesting. And another thing that I thought was interesting was how you kind of put in this whole notion of nonviolence, and it kind of and again, it could be something that is very unique of IR. But nonviolence in political science, I mean, since you're talking about organization, there's a lot of indoctrination that goes on in these rebel groups. So when you're talking about indoctrination, when you talk about, socialization, you also, I think, need to talk about psychological violence as well. I don't know. I felt that was probably not kind of taken into account too much. So, but I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there for you. Another thing that caught my attention was rebelocracy. I had never heard this term before, so I kind of Googled to see as to what that was and how that played into this. So that was something you learn every day. That was something that I learned from your paper. So thank you for that. And this whole notion of greedy institution, again, as I said earlier, this forming of organization. I mean, and I'm not talking about modern organization. You talk about medieval organization. This whole the character and the nature of organization is such that it demands total loyalty and subservience and conformity. And so I don't know if that is kind of seeping into this as well. So regardless of how modern they say or they call themselves, or I don't know if it's just a rhetoric that they used, but maybe there's that element of organizing that is seeping into the Maoist organization also. And I remember as to how, there was one individual by the name of Ralph Hummel who said that every organization needs like an individual or an official who is, a trunkless or truncated remnant of human being, headless, soulless. So, you just cannot have head when you're in an organization. You cannot have soul, symbolically speaking, because you have to completely give yourself to the organization. So I don't know if that is going on in here. Another thing, I don't know how much time I have, but then this whole notion of nationhood, nation from a feminist point of view, that also has very masculine traits to it. So you probably want to kind of delve into that as well. And then interestingly, you talked about social contract, and classic political philosophy talks about how social contract basically mirrors the general will. I'm not talking about Rousseau, so to speak, but generally kind of it mirrors the majority will or the general will, or whatever you want to call it. And maybe that is what is going on in here, because they have to kind of they have to impress a community or communities. They probably very tacitly, they're probably trying to kind of placate them or trying to not make them irate by going very, very against the social norms. So maybe that is what is happening in here as well. Because you talked about backlash also. So maybe they're trying to avoid the backlash, but at the same time, through this social contract, they're kind of, mirroring the general will or the majority will of the community that they're operating in. So it could be that also, but this is all, I think this is all that I have in front of me, but thank you so much, Dr. Giri, for allowing me to comment on your work. Again, as I said earlier, it was very interesting. So thank you. And over to Dr. Khadka.
Sorry, excuse me. Thank you very much, Dr. Pyakuryal. Would you want to comment? Would you want to
sure.
follow up on Dr. Pyakuryal's comments? Yes.
Yeah, so thank you for such a kind and generous comment. A few things. Yes, the interplay of patriarchy with social relationship and also intersection between patriarchy and capitalism. I think I didn't do justice to that in this paper. That's why in prelude to the webinar today, I was mentioning that I have written another article that delves deeper into that, while also discussing the ontology of insurgency, I think, which also plugs into the comment that you made about bureaucracy. The idea of bureaucracy is state-centric, and then yes, rebel groups, they are wannabe states, but also they are counter state force, right? They want to do in things in different way than a state would want to do. Nevertheless, in either way, discussion of organization, institutions, and embeddedness of patriarchy in its various manifestation into those organization and institutions, no matter if even if they are informal, would be that would be fascinating. And yeah, and also partly discussion of bureaucracy in rebel governance literature becomes difficult, and then I am guessing that's why we don't have much literature on marriage and sexuality, is that because marriage and sexuality are often regulated with through informal institutions, rules and norms, and these are difficult to define and difficult to quantify. So that's the challenge that we have in exploring this very important aspect of rebel governance. And another, I think, the weakness, for the lack of a better term, of this paper is lack of clear definition on what constitutes violence and coercion, non-violence, and it can be defined in various ways. And like you rightly mentioned, there are systematic, right, subtle forms of violence, even though in a marriage and sexuality, even though marriage was not forced in Maoist instance in Nepal, even though lack of sexual violence within a group, there was violence, right? Combatants wouldn't choose to marry or engage in relationship if they had other options. So they were constrained in many ways. So that's why I start with the caveat in my paper that I'm taking marriage and sexuality in a very narrow way. But and that's where the potential of this research lies, to expanding from there and then including all other different forms of relationship and effectual ties, and expanding the horizon of this research. Yeah, and in rebelocracy, that's a neologism. So there is a lot of neologism. Anna Arjona comes with this rebelocracy terms, and she then coins another term, eleocracy, and there are so many neologism in rebel governance literature, partly because this is new. I think it flourished in last 5 to 7 years time, and then establishing itself firmly as a subdiscipline within international relation. Yeah, but thank you so much for all those wonderful comments and then giving me different ways to think about my paper.
Thank you very much. Let's open the floor for questions. So ladies and gentlemen, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask questions directly to Dr. Giri, or you can post your questions in the chat box.
If there's no question, can I I have a short.
Of course, go ahead, man. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. So, Soma, I think this is a very important So, Dr. Giri, while I was talking about bureaucracy, I just wanted to kind of, make parallels in regards to theories on organizations versus bureaucracy, because they're very similar. So not bureaucracy per se, but, theories that actually, that are going to kind of, create, or that are going to run organizations. They also have these very structural, very rigid kind of rules. So I was trying to kind of equate organization with bureaucracy. So not talk about bureaucracy, so to speak, but just to kind of make an analogy there. So it's just a clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, this is new. New kind of territory for me, and my knowledge is thin here. Although that might sound counterintuitive, because I'm looking at rebel governance, and I need to be familiar with those terms. But and that's area something I would look forward to understand and learn more, and I think I can. That's where this research can be further extended.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen?
There's one question in the chat box.
Yes. Oh, there you go. Would you want to read it, ma'am, or?
Sure.
Or
Sexuality as a subjective issue with vague interpretations. What were the several struggles you faced on gathering data? May I know, please? So this is with regard to your data collection.
Yeah, that's very important questions, and that's and I have written actually a whole article on that on International Studies Review. Exploring this topic was not easy for me as a male researcher, and talking about all those issues, right, with female combatants. So my positionality becomes really important when I'm talking about this. But this is something I didn't bring up in my interviews, as I lay out this clearly in my methodology section. That's where abductive analysis is so useful for me, because my empirical data was different than I had expected, and that led me to theory building. So what it essentially meant was that when I went out in the field, my aim was to understand and explore the complex experiences of women combatants, how they, in such a patriarchal setup, managed to, become combatant and move up the ladder, become commander, that was fascinating for me, because I can remember in 2006, early months of 2006, I think it was in March or April, I forgot, and Maoists attacked my district headquarters. And I'm not kind of brave or strong person, right? So there was helicopter hovering around and firing, and I was just hiding under my bed. And then after all those, the cloud got cleared, and then after the attack, the Maoists, they were retreating, and then I saw female combatants, and then when I looked at them, they were fearless, and there was distinct form of calmness on their face, and that's how I got attracted. So I wanted to explore how they experience war as a female, like what was like it to be in war, and how are they experiencing their post-war lives. But this discussion of marriage and sexuality automatically came into front. Like I didn't ask them, but they were keen to, when I asked about their marriage and all that, they would happily talk about this, and they were presenting it as a great thing about Maoist insurgency because it was so progressive, it was so a modern conception, and they were presenting as if that was a great achievement. So that caught my interest and something that I found consistently in all my interviews. And that's how I came to this topic. So if it was not for interest of my interviewees, it would have been very difficult for me to talk about this topic. But it was initiated by my interviewees. They're so keen to talk about it. Their face lit up when they talk about it. Something that was not clear when I was in field, but once I came back from the field and started looking at notes and then memos, fieldwork memos and transcript and all that, this was surprising for me. And that's how I started writing on this. But, I wished I had discussed more in detail, something I was hesitant given my gender and my positionality. But something I explore that in far more detailed way in my article, my discomfort and also my positionality, the power dynamics embedded into such fieldwork. Yeah, I'm happy to share with you if you write to me. And Rupaji, I think you know my email address. I can share it with you.
Well, I just have a quick comment, because I enjoyed reading your paper, Dr. Giri. I was thinking as I thought about your article, I was also like trying to relate to current political events. For example, I was thinking about Jwala Kumari Shah, who is now not with Maoist anymore with the UML, but she's become a minister. I was thinking about Unsari Karti Magga. You link this non-coercive, non-violent governance of marriage and sexuality to let's say the consolidation and legitimization of political power for the Maoist, and how it shapes the political I guess dynamics. But I was thinking, does this also have any effect at the individual level, right? For example, the political aspirations of these, especially women combatants who've been married, who were married during, let's say, war. So I was trying to extend your research into this normative question of how does it affect these combatants individually, because Jwala Kumari Shah was quite bold to defect from the Maoist party and join UML. And I was reading her interview only the other day, and I was just trying to relate these two, I guess, outcomes. So any thoughts, because I'm just curious to know, the individual, how does it affect individually, especially in particular, the individual political aspirations of such combatants who've been married during wartime to, let's say, a fellow Maoist combatant. Just trying to link the two.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in the beginning, I started my fieldwork. I think it goes back to my, fieldwork. I started with the Kathmandu. I then went to 9 other districts of Nepal, Rolpa, Rukum, Dang, and then also eastern districts. The narrative of success that I heard in Kathmandu when I spoke with the top rank Maoist leaders was different from the stories of female ex-combatants that I encountered in remote areas in Rolpa, Rukum. So it depends on who you ask on this question. Certainly there has been a lot of empowerment. People like Jwala Shah, Ansari Karti, Pamphapushal, they have been to position of power, and they have managed to break free of a lot of patriarchal hurdles in process, and they have inspired many, right? Let's not deny that fact, and that's where I think intersectional lens becomes useful here, how do we understand differing, often conflicting stories coming from different female ex-combatants. Some are frustrated, right? They, some of the female ex-combatants, I spoke in Rukum and in Rupandai, they said that they wish they, they were in Maoist incidents in Nepal when they were in the state of war, when there was more equality, they were treated equally, respected, they had dignified life. Now no one cares about them, and they don't have linkage and network to get to the position of power. Their situation is essentially same, and their leaders have abandoned them. And often when I see those kind of stories, when I look at their social location, often I can find that they come from remote areas of Nepal, lower class, lower caste, and then they abandoned their education, they couldn't complete their education, and so on. So this complex experience becomes more legible with the intersectional lens. I think that's where the answer lies. But like I said, there is no uniform narrative here.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Giri. Dr. Pyakuryal, I'll just jump in if you don't mind, and I'll read out the comments or questions
Absolutely.
from the chat box. Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Giri, Dr. Yamuna Gale, in fact, has asked for your paper, but it's coming out. It's actually coming out. I think it's with the ISQ. But if you don't mind, you could, I would like to request you to share it with Dr. Yamuna Gale, if it's okay. That's her request.
Yeah,
And,
I can share.
Thank you. And
but
we
yeah,
have Mr. Got you. And we have Mr. Aryal, providing a brief comment, but then he's also, shared his short blog about marriage and divorce among combatants. And he shared the link. So maybe, it will be useful for you to have a quick look. Otherwise, I think, yes, we've just reached the, an hour and 15 minutes mark. And once again, let me take this opportunity to thank Dr. Keshab Giri for his wonderful presentation, which is actually coming out in a very, very prestigious journal, IR journal, International Studies Quarterly. Thank you, Dr. Giri. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Sucheta Pyakuryal, who's taken her time, despite a very busy schedule, to join us today. Thank you very much, ma'am. And ladies and gentlemen, we hope to see you next month. And let's give a warm applause to our speaker today and to our discussant. And let us also say goodbye to both our speakers and discussant, and hope to see you in February.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And then also thank you for asking those deep questions. And thank you especially to Dr. Pyakuryal for such a generous and kind reading of my paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, ma'am.